over to the people, looking through my peephole. Who's knocking at my door? Who is it?
Hey, welcome back. Another week for New Sense Productions to explore the potential of equity, diversity, and inclusion in shaping our organizations that we work in and the communities that we live in every day. And I'm so honored to once again be in full partnership and conversation with Sacha Thompson and Peyina Lynn Roberts. I think we have a pretty interesting topic to bring in today, you guys. We spent some time really thinking, taking a week off and thinking about how we want to both grow the platform of this show, continue to engage new voices in our community, and also coming up with themes that are relevant and persistent to both challenging oppression, this moment of racial uprise and COVID, and our intersection as DEI practitioners and Generation Xers. So today, we thought, why don't we look at how each of us has a lens of otherness. Even me as a white male heterosexual, there are pieces of my life that sometimes make me an outsider or other, or even marginalized within white male culture, even as I'm privileged and benefited by that very same culture. And, talking about how each of us also has degrees of insiderness within that capital work culture that we all participate in. So just starting there, I'd love to hear from both of you, maybe swinging over to you first, Peyina, this time. In what ways do you see yourself as an other or outsider when it comes to business culture, for instance, in the US particularly?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I'm glad you framed it in terms of business culture, because otherwise I could go on because my life was all about otherness.
Right.
In terms of business culture, it's really interesting because I come particular to a DEI space from a background that has intersections with the research community, with the service community, coaching community. And so even in that respect, there's a lot of work that I need to do to validate myself. So in that sense, perhaps there's a little bit of otherness in terms of doing DEI work.
What does that slow down there? You just said a lot. What do you mean there's a lot of work you have to do to validate yourself? Do you mean the way you talk to yourself, that others talk to you? Could you give us a flavor of that?
Well, last time, I don't know if it was during a recording or not, but I think we had this conversation of how sometimes DEI practitioners might be a little critical towards each other, especially if they are from the same race, right? And I've also, so I facilitate a study group on white fragility, and I also have heard from participants in that group how when others are commenting about white fragility or other kinds of things, that it might be hard for them to see it as such, or to just accept that knowledge if they feel that they've done more work. So if I were to use myself as an example, if I feel like I've done more work than Sacha, then I go like, oh, I'm not gonna listen to Sacha. So there's a lot of that kind of like that tension inside this profession, as well as about like who
that
has
is the rank and that jockeying.
That rank, and like, like you should look at the history of the work that people have previously done, and righteously so. And at the same time, I think that we need to examine how that might put us in danger of not examining ourselves or enclosing ourselves just because the knowledge comes from someone that may be seen as newer in the profession, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm gonna pause there for a second so we can invite Sacha into the conversation.
Yeah, like I'm taking that in because I think I do that to some extent, right? Where there are some folks, and I think about it as, do I see you actually doing the work, right? Because it's one thing to do the work and be learning in that process and trying to educate yourself because you are new in the work, versus being in the work and just saying, oh yeah, I'm a practitioner, but not connected to the community, not trying to educate yourself. Like I think there's a fine line between that. And that's the part that I think agitates me a little bit in this space. And so, and just thinking about otherness, I know there are a lot of practitioners, because of their lived experience, they lean into that more so than education. right? Or understanding the history or the psychology or anthropology or whatever aspect of diversity that you want to bring from an educational standpoint. And lived experience does provide some experience, but I don't think that that's everything, right? I think it needs to be a balance. And so, you know, as you were talking, I was kind of thinking through, okay, well, how do you really balance that? Right? And how do you validate the classroom work versus the lived experience? And so that's, I'm really noodling on that, because I think that that's a piece that we often don't take into consideration.
What do you
That's
think
beautiful.
happens? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Peyina.
No, I was going to say, I think you touched on something already really critical to figure out that balance, and that's that attitude of learning, right? So if you are starting from a lived experience, no matter where you start from, right? You could be starting from a lived experience direction and come from that, and yet understand that the lived experience is going to be very individual to you. So therefore be open to learning what work has been done before your lived experience, and how can you be open to learning that. Similarly, if you're coming from the books and the certificates and whatnot, then, well, most of the people also have lived experience in some way, but if you're not having the either the cross-racial, whichever ever type of, because we can only have the race that we have, whether it be mixed or not, right? And so how does it show up in other people? Kind of be open to that experience. And at the same time, I think we discussed this a little bit when we were planning for this, but and being open and understanding that the otherness doesn't necessarily come from a white to other, that I think there's a power structure at play. And so whoever is, so I just heard the talk by Ibram X. Kendi about how it's like whoever is in power can to do the policies, the rules and whatnot, regardless of color of their skin, has the power to be that instantiation of oppression, right?
Yep.
Well, that's what I found so interesting about it. You know, in my work with WMFDP, one of the ways we contextualize this work is talking about insiders and outsiders. So how we're talking about our otherness here, we would often call that an outsider, somebody outside of the sphere of influence, the nexus of power and privilege that insiders often unconsciously have because of different identity categories we're in. Some of mine often are white, male, heterosexual, middle class, for example. And so that insiderness really connotates that, whereas the outsiderness is the degrees to which I either have to switch up, downplay, assimilate, or code switch my style, if I even can on something. Skin color, how much can you do that without going to skin lightening cream, which we've seen as actually an impact of this in certain ways, you know, from the Caribbean to the US and beyond. But, you know, to which degree do I have to downplay that otherness or outsiderness to even survive, let alone excel in a system that doesn't recognize or see me or creates unintentionally or intentionally roadblocks to my identity? And what I find so interesting, whether through the DEI practitioner lens as a white male or just a white male in general, is that I do have degrees of otherness. I'm married to a Black woman, which doesn't mean that I live the Black experience, but it means I'm emotionally and viscerally connected out in an everyday experience beyond my own race to another. I'm Jewish, and that's often still outside the Christian hegemony. And there's certain, you know, stances and ways that I choose to stand up for equity and choose to, I guess, stand up to white supremacy in myself and in society that often can make me somewhat of an other. And I have to choose then, when I'm going after a paycheck, because we're all DEI practitioners in the market, in the capitalist market, do I collude with what I know to be the insider culture that is around me at all times, which has historically benefited white men like myself on a group level, although individually has probably kept me in a box that is detrimental to my own growth? So do I choose to assimilate to that because I know those rules and that's easier? Or do I risk breaking rank with that? And I think you see my experience, so many people of color right now, especially with white people and even younger generations of white people, losing patience sometimes with the the degree of deliberation with which white people tend to be calibrating the impact of their actions and how that might impact their relationships with other white people, for example, or men with other men. So that's one of the aspects I really think about in this conversation too, of otherness.
Could you, Noah, unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's really where privilege to me is, again, unconscious bias, is that if the more that I am privileged by a system that recognizes my insiderness as opposed to my otherness, so again, my whiteness, my maleness, my extrovertedness, whatever are the different dynamics that resonate with other insiders in that company, to whatever degree I have visibility on that, but yet internally I have these differences. I believe in diversity, equity, inclusion. I believe in intervening for equity. I believe in looking at my own white privilege, which might set me apart from other insiders. That is my opportunity to either leverage my otherness and lean in with courage and empathy and connect with and support and challenge other white people about our mindsets and behaviors in that minute. Or that is the opportunity that I can choose to say, you know what? This is a good thing I've got going on here. I do want to feed my family. It is complex. I, do come from working class. I got a young daughter, and right now I'm going to go ahead and play the white American or the male role, and not really notice that microaggression, that intervention, the way that this insider culture is actually a detriment to others and perhaps beneficial to me. And that's what I mean. I often have these sets of choices to leverage the otherness for equity, or to hide beneath the insider label for comfort. I'm wondering how that's similar or different for each of you, particularly as women of color and other factors that come into your identities.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. And so I think, the example that came for me was, though I was born outside the country, I have a very American accent, right? And so I can lean into my Americanness to get into spaces. But because of that, I can also influence conversation around immigration or other Black cultures, and do it in a way that people are like, oh yeah, we didn't think about that, right? So we've been talking about Black Lives Matter forever, and I'm like, you realize there are Black people outside the U.S., right? What's the impact there? And being able to lean into that aspect of who I am to start raising those voices, or because I'm now in spaces that are having these decision-making conversations, I can pull those voices in with me, right? So that's kind of the example that came up for me. Though I am an outsider, there are aspects of my outsiderness that's inside that I can lean into.
I have a question about that for you as it pertains to race in the U.S. And I am not asking you to speak for all Black people, but I'm wondering your individual experience with this. Do you notice in general, and I guess I am generalizing here, but do white people do we tend to be more comfortable with foreign Black people than U.S. Black people? Because my assumption behind that is that it divorces me of the discomfort of having to think about the legacy of slavery and my complex relations to it. Instead, I can just be enticed by this magical brown-skinned person that I don't have to feel guilty about my white skin in. And I know I'm going for a far reach here, but that's a bit of our show. We're allowed to do that. And I'm wondering if there's resonances of that, or and I could also see, quite conversely, because of wars all over the world, how Black skin is feared everywhere, and there's a price to be paid for that by communities all over the world. I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think, what's the song? There's levels to this,
yeah.
Right? I think there's definitely levels to it. I think as a whole, you are impacted by racism regardless. Born in the U.S., born outside the U.S. I think the nuance comes in with particularly people that have immigrated to the U.S. older folks that don't have that historical vantage point of racism as a part of American history, that don't necessarily understand why they're impacted by something that has absolutely nothing to do with them, right? Like, that's something that I started to really notice. What's different with me is I've been here since I was 2. I grew up in Virginia, of all places, right? And so went to college in Colonial Williamsburg. So it's been something that's been I've been surrounded by, and I've learned a lot about. But because of that, I think that has helped me with my DEI work, because I can lean in and lean out of my Caribbean-ness or lean into my American-ness. Right.
Yeah, it's interesting that you both are talking about it in a very conscious way. So meaning that you're leaning in or leaning out or choosing one way or the other as a conscious choice. And I bring that consciousness up because I would imagine it's not always the same for everybody. And in fact, a lot of the conscious choice comes from our awareness and our constant dialogue internally about this, because we're DEI practitioners. But I'm imagining that that often the consciousness of the choice, it's a retroactive rationalization, so that it happened and we rationalize it. And I'm saying this in the sense that I think of myself as a younger me, right? When I didn't have this level of consciousness, and imagine a teenager. At this time, I'm in Costa Rica. And what mattered was more the validation and the belonging than the conscious choice of whether I'm leaning in or not. And even as an adult, 20-some-year-old, I'm in a different environment in the US, in a research environment, in a lab that's fully white. I don't think I was conscious about it either. And again, that was about survival and fitting in and being seen as fit, a team player and whatnot. And it's not until these last 10 years, I would say, that I have more consciousness about how I'm choosing to lean in, collude, or what is it, like the vocabulary that Noah just used?
Lean in, lean out, or disrupt and collude, you know?
Exactly. And even then, I don't think I can take it to the extent of disrupting right there, because I've learned that how people view me as an Asian woman. In fact, I don't think people think of me as Asian American. It's just Asian, right? It changes the way their emotional response to me is tied to their stereotypes of Asians.
What's
and
an
so if I am
that? What's
well, I think it's a little, if it's, well, it's different for immigrants versus Asian Americans, but if it's an immigrant, I think people expect you to be more submissive, more quiet, less outspoken, right? And so depending on whether they know that distinction, it just makes, you know, if it's a very foreign way of stereotyping Asians, it might be just like that, but that's not me. And therefore the emotional response is one of like, you're just angry and disrespectful and whatnot, rather than understanding where I'm coming from. So I become the angry Asian woman instead of Asian. And that just, I've learned from, I'm sorry?
Fiery and other stereotypes then get associated.
Right. And so it doesn't benefit me at that point in time to disrupt straight away. Because even with very little conscious choice of disrupting, it's already disruptive by my not being fitting the norm. And so I have to consciously choose to walk a longer trajectory of not colluding, not assimilating fully, but finding ways to raise that awareness over time, which is a lot of work.
Sounds exhausting.
Yeah. And you know what, the term that popped up when you started talking was code switching, right? Like it's, okay, this is how I have to act here, or what I'm expected to do. And to your point, that's about belonging. And once you start getting to a point of, it's too tiring to code switch, or I don't have the energy, or this is just not the day, then things start to change. I was on a panel maybe about a year ago, and that was one of the topics. And they said, when did you stop code switching? And I really had to think about that. Like, what was that pivotal moment where I was just like, no, I'm good. Like, I can't put the mask on anymore.
Is it an everyday off for all people? I mean, I also imagine it'd be a daily choice almost. Like even me, like with a lot of privilege, I feel like that's kind of what privilege allows you to do, check out. So it's like a daily choice to opt in on my part. But I wonder for people that are more seen by their otherness or outsiderness, like especially because you do have to survive on capital, like is
Daily
there some
choice.
daily negotiations? But it sounds like you, Sasha, if I'm hearing you correctly, were like, for me personally, I came to a place where it's Sasha is Sasha. Wow.
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would agree. I think I want to make it very clear that it's not about, to me, it's no longer about code switching. I'm glad you brought that up, but it's let's put it this way. If if all the people I work with, coworkers, whatever service place I am, had the awareness and consciousness um, about racial oppression and about other types of oppression like the both of you did, then I wouldn't have to think in terms of how to make this workable.
Mm,
Yeah.
But I'm in places where
mm,
the level of awareness about racial discrimination or racial difference and racial oppression
mm,
is not very high.
mm,
And so it's like it is my, I see my role as partly in a long-term relationship, trying to gradually educate folks, but without actually having an explicit education. So it takes time and effort, and it takes buy-in. And so it's about how to develop those relationships. And yes, it is tiring, but I do find it that I'm still me. I'm no longer the adolescent looking for validation, if that makes
Right.
sense. Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
think it does make sense. I think too, like white men that are now coming into this, and white people, period, that are now coming into again this racial justice uprising, this moment of COVID, this moment of disrupting life as insiders have known it up till now, are really there's a lot there. I think there's a bit of a learning curve going on, and if we think about it in terms of race, white and gender, male, like the need to tap into that otherness, to actually even be seen as authentic right now, as people are trying to delineate. I can't even trust the government, some folks say, because if I don't trust the health and I don't know what's what with COVID. I look over in Portland. I'm scared to see, like, gosh man,
Yeah.
that really scares me, to be honest with you. um, Unmarked cars and all these things I'm hearing when people are standing up, sounds like moms and dads,
DC.
right? I mean, black communities have known police repression for a long time. I understand. So, but it just seems like there's a learning curve where it's like, yeah, right now it's about tapping into your otherness, even if discomfort arises from that, and looking at what parts of that otherness, what does it mean, what has it meant for you to hide that, conceal that, water that down, whether you're privileged by the system or not, and what impact does that have on us overall. And I would invite, actually, I'd love to come back to you in a second, Sasha, as our listeners are going to hear this. I would invite, and we would invite all of you to know that we're actually going to take a couple weeks off between this and our next show, and we really want to hear from all of you. We want to begin engaging the community in a real, authentic way. We'd love it if you could send an email, or even a voice recording on your phone and email it that way, and we can get your voice on. But we'd love to hear some of your experiences when you've either leveraged some of that otherness or outsiderness to speak up and to intervene against oppression and inequity, or times that maybe you did actually collude or keep that down or assimilate in because you felt your family's survival or other aspects were on the line, and what emotional toll that took on you. So we'd love to capture those stories. When are we coming back on, Peyina and Sasha, with our next show?
I believe it's sometime after August 12th.
Great. So send us, your thoughts, queries, stories, probably
By August 12th.
by August 12th. We'd love that. And we'll be doing social media reminders. Anyway, thanks for that. So Sasha, coming back over to you, as we begin to kind of move towards thinking about ways that, as we usually do in our show, how we might want to actionize some of our learning. I just want to come back to you, though, again, feelings, thoughts, perspectives that haven't been entertained in this conversation so far about the power of leveraging our otherness and not always going along to get along.
Yeah, I think, as we were talking earlier around, it's a process, right? To get from wanting that belonging piece to saying, okay, I'm taking this mask off. there's power in otherness, right? And so once you understand that power and can lean into that power, and use your voice and your story, you'll find the others, right? And it may not be the exact same situation, but what I have found is when I speak up as an other, that others hear and listen and say, oh, okay, thank you. Like, thank you for that. I don't feel alone. And so there's power in numbers. And the more that we can start having the others' voices shine, the more we can start dismantling some of these systems, because that's the problem. There's so many others that's dispersed that we need to just come in and collect, right? And then that's how you start to dismantle and break some of the long-standing structures that have been in place.
Reminds me of the saying, each one teach one.
That's it.
Peyina, what would you add in on that from your angle?
Yeah, actually, I have two thoughts. One is related to othering others, meaning if I'm another and I know I'm another, but even there I have internalized a white supremacist thinking, let's call it internalized racism, and I'm thinking of yet another the way white supremacist culture thinks about that other. And so it's like I've been othered by white culture, but I'm also othering yet another culture of color or gender or whatever it is because of white supremacist culture. And so just being aware that it's not just between whites and non-whites, that it also exists between non-whites and non-whites, different types of non-whites, right? And so being aware of that is really important, because I think that I myself have experienced that, not just as the oppressor, but also the oppressed. And it's when we stop recognizing that we may be perpetrators ourselves, that we limit change, right? We have to be open to that.
That's another show.
Right.
That's a whole other show.
Yeah. And
here.
Yeah.
Damn.
The second thought, I just forgot what the second thought was,
Right,
but I think it had to do with, I'll come back to it. I forgot.
I just want to amplify what you just said. When we stop recognizing that we also, I mean, you said it better. What can you say that again?
I said that when we stop recognizing that we could also be perpetrators of oppression, that's when we limit change.
I mean, that's the bottom line of why we leverage that otherness and don't collude right there. Powerful.
Oh, I remembered it. That's okay.
You earned it, girl. Bring it in.
Yeah. So because we're asking our listeners to submit, or our viewers, we're not just an audio, our viewers and listeners to submit their experiences, whether because they want a commentary from us, whether they want a second opinion, or because they just want to find community. I also want to make it very clear that we're not talking about otherness, in terms of assimilating or not. We're not viewing it as a judgment of whether someone is racist or not. I know, because there's a lot of conversation that, you can only either be racist or not racist. But again, I think we're framing it in terms of a lens of humanity and survival, that we weave in and out of different ways of behaving. And it's important to recognize how we behave in and out if we want to seek change. Right. Just to say, I'm always anti-racist. I'm sorry, but that's not the case, because we do sometimes kind of give in a little to a situation, because that's being human, because we have the need to also survive, right? And so I just want to make sure that we make that very clear, so our viewers don't feel hesitant to submit for fear of being judged.
Right, absolutely. When we shine that light, and when we all, I think, can say, here's how I act in that way too, we give permission to actually think on a higher level by recognizing the ways that's holding us back from advancing structural equity. And you just said it wonderfully. So let's close out each with maybe how we might want to take some of the ways we've shown up and learned and inspired each other today, as well as inviting our listeners really into a new form of partnership with us at New Sense Productions. Let's take a minute though individually to check out and think of one way that we want to move forward when it comes to leveraging otherness for equity, moving beyond this conversation. I think for me, I'll start with that. I'm really keen on really exploring right now generational partnerships, and in what ways do I speak up and support boomers who have done really important DEI work before me. Think particularly of white men and other whites that I've learned from, and in what ways do I challenge some of the older mindsets and keep asking us to do our work and show up in partnership and show up in continuing our mindsets and behaviors of advancing equity. And in the same spirit, I've found a really good challenge lately from participating in conversations with millennials, which I haven't done a lot of in this conversation, and allowing my own perspectives, feelings, thoughts, and mindsets to be challenged sometimes along generational lines, and the urgency that comes with this work too. And I think that's really vital right now. So that's one of my commitments. What about you? Let's go over to Sacha this time.
I think for me, it's continuing being that voice for the others, right? And continuing to coax and encourage others to lean into that as a power versus a detriment. I was having a conversation today with someone that's like, we talk about underrepresented, and it's just the words that we use just diminish people, right? And so how can we empower folks to lean into the beauty of what makes them different? And so continue to encourage that.
I love that.
That's beautifully said. That's beautifully said, because I think that reminds me of how it's important for me to continue to examine the language I use and make sure that I'm not using language that I've internalized from the main culture that is in fact oppressing others by the language I use. And also working on building more community, both with our allies and people that can have the power, more power than I do, to make change in communities where, you'd be surprised. I just see, mothers not willing to talk because things are uncomfortable, or see people refusing to be interested in the organization's DEI training because it's uncomfortable or because they think they know it, and so just working on building community to support the otherness, but also not just amongst the others, but also bringing allyship in that work.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both for your time today and our continued partnership. I want to remind folks to again reach out to us at nspmediahosts@gmail.com with both questions and stories of times you've either leveraged your otherness for equity or times that you have needed to assimilate, if that's the word, or code switch or tone down in order to survive, and what that impact was on you. And we want to encourage you also, if you're able to do that on a voicemail recording and send that in. And we'd love to begin blending in other voices in addition to the three of us. So thank you for your time, and we will see you again around August 14th. Take care.
Submit by August 12th, 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, your question or story related to your experience of leaning in and out of otherness to disrupt or collude with workplace oppression. Submit at https://cutt.ly/NSPOTHERNESS. That's cut.ly/NSP Otherness. Thank you.
Back in my apartment, compartmentalize, divide and conquer from below equator, dividing subcontinents.